Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to Into Snaps. I'm very excited to be joined by Michael Pugh, who is a big supporter of UBI, is the co-founder and director of the Basic Income Conversation. Now, so I'm really pleased to have you on this week, because I think it's been a really interesting week for UBI in the UK in particular, because obviously we've had our local elections. And I guess you could almost say they were the first elections in British history which UBI played a sort of, well, not significant, might be overdoing it, but it was part of the conversation. So obviously in Scotland, you had 4 of the 5 main party leaders being at least positive towards it. In Wales, I think you've now got about half of the Welsh Parliament are UBI advocates on paper. I mean, is this a big step forward?
A huge step forward. I think just to see basic income being on the agenda, I think is significant and a big step forward. I think most commentators would say for a long time it's been on the fringes of politics as an idea. And I think not just in the UK, but around the world, you're starting to see basic income into the mainstream of discussion. And it's exciting that it's not just one politician or one political party that's promoting it. You're starting to see quite a consensus cross-party, particularly on the progressive side, about what this might do, and that means in the next, parliaments, be that in Scotland or in Wales or across local authorities and mayoralties, there is now a mandate for politicians to explore that in greater detail. So absolutely, I think it is significant, and as you say, I think it's probably the first time, maybe in modern history, that it's been such a crucial part of the election.
I mean, do you expect there to be UBI trials? Because I think this is what you guys are pushing for now is UBI trials. And obviously, you've got politicians across the UK who say they support UBI trials. But do you think this is actually going to lead to UBI trials in practice?
It's a good question. That's where I think there's a school of thought that in order to get to a full rollout or even a partial rollout of a basic income, that we would like to see a pilot. Not because necessarily we need to know any more data, because I think there's been enough pilots around the world that suggests what that can do. But I think pilots play an important role in legitimizing the idea, and storytelling, really, in terms of kind of debunking some of the myths that people may have around what people would do with the money. So that would be the role of them, and therefore I think the challenge at the moment, of course, is that because of the way our politics is so centralised around Westminster, in order to do a pilot, we will need the to do a pilot at scale, we would need the cooperation of the Westminster government. And if I'm being honest, at this moment in time, I don't see that being likely. However, I think what we could see, and something that us at the Basic Income Conversation are exploring, is more micro pilots. So perhaps things of, perhaps sort of 50 or 100 households, rather than the kind of massive thousands and control groups and things like that. Something that are more akin to some of the demonstrations that we've seen in the US, which, as I said, are quite small in sample size, but can tell a really big story. And I think the benefit of those types of pilots is that they don't necessarily have to have millions and millions of pounds of public money being pumped into them. They might be able to be crowd-funded or philanthropically funded. And so I think that might be the kind of route that we will see in the next few years. It'd be great if we can have a handful of those get off the ground.
Yeah, I will come back to some of this, because you mentioned a very interesting point about progressive parties being in favour of it. But clearly the Tories and centre-right or right-wing parties around the world generally still seem very sceptical. But to kind of go back to the beginning, I mean, how did you first become interested in basic income?
Sure. So right at the beginning, well, when I first heard about it, I was studying politics at university, and it was just one of the modules on there. And I've got to be honest, when I first heard about it, I thought this is a crazy idea. This is never going to happen. And I suppose that was the thing that stuck with me for quite a long time. But after, my background is in community organising. So for a long time, I worked on the living wage campaign. And I suppose living wage is my route into basic income for two reasons. Partly as a frustration So we were broadly winning the living wage campaign, still really, really important, having lots of success, but began to see that, well, we had this phrase, which was work is the surest way out of poverty.
Yeah.
Basically, I just didn't believe that anymore because of the experience. We were working with low paid workers, even after they'd won a living wage and in well paid work, they were still living quite insecure lives. And I began to realize it was this sense of insecurity that was actually the kind of main problem here. It's not necessarily whether you're in work or in well-paid work or not, however important that is. It's more the kind of insecurity that people have, and that's because, you know, being driven by the changing labour market that we see around flexibility, and also the beginnings of kind of the changes with technology. And so I kind of returned to basic income, I suppose, as an idea. And realize that maybe, yeah, this is kind of one of the answers to this problem. The other kind of route from the living wage, I suppose, was an inspiration, because I've seen what this kind of unlikely alliance of community groups from civil society, businesses, politicians, kind of this unlikely coalition of actors that can come together and actually have a massive impact and take what the living wage was. That actually not many people, it's only 15-20 years ago people thought that was a crazy idea, and actually that's now become mainstream, and you ended up with a Conservative government introducing, you know, what they called the national living wage, although it's not the real living wage. You know, they were literally taking our language. So I think there's lots of lessons there, basically, much of which draw from a community organizing tradition, in terms of how we can maybe apply that to basic income and see similar success over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. So that was kind of my route into it, and I was then lucky enough to travel to the US, Canada, and India as part of a Churchill Fellowship, which was very lucky for me to go out and spend some time with advocates out there, and also visit some of the pilots and think about bringing that learning back to the UK. And that's ultimately where I came across Compass, and ultimately ended up setting up what's now known as the Basic Income Conversation.
And where were these pilots? I mean, and also kind of like, what did you find when you actually got there?
Yeah, so this was the summer of 2019, and
we could travel.
There was but we could travel, and it was the beginnings of a kind of a growth of quite small scale pilots across the United States. So I was lucky enough to go to Stockton, California, which were just starting their trial at the time.
Is that Michael? Trying to remember the mayor's name. I think it
Mayor Michael Tubbs.
Yes.
Yes, same name as me. And and the Stockton pilot results actually just came out in March, April time. So quite recent, but I was there earlier on when they were just starting, and that was really one of the first. But there was a handful of others. There was a lot in California. There was one ongoing in Jackson, Mississippi. There were some others on the East Coast that were just kind of in their early phases of getting set up, and then the other one was in Canada, in Ontario, which was sadly cancelled by, they had a kind of incoming Trump-like politician who cancelled the pilot halfway through, which was an enormous shame, because it was probably one of the best designed, most extensive pilots that there was. And so all that was left was the stories of people who had been on the pilot. So that was kind of the picture at the time. Since then, the United States, you know, it's exploded in terms of basic income experiments and pilots. The same mayor, Michael Tubbs, went on to set up something called Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, and you're now seeing over 40 cities experimenting with cash transfers and basic income, which has been really, really exciting. And I would say the biggest learning for me, it would go back to this thing about what's the purpose of a pilot. I don't think it's really about getting any more data on what people would or wouldn't do with the money. I think, as I said, I think that there's enough of that out there that we know already. But I do think they are critical in helping to shift the narrative around what people would do, being very story driven. I think the success of the Stockton pilot, for example, is that the sample size was only 125 people, yet Mayor Tubbs and the participants are in newspapers all around the US, across the media, getting global attention, and it's that story that is so important. And I think that's the role that pilots can play moving forward.
I mean, obviously, basic income has been an idea which has been knocking around for, literally centuries, especially on the progressive side of politics. But what really seems to have changed in perhaps the last decade, last 15 years, is you had a lot of tech people getting very interested in it. People who are convinced that rising AI or the rising power of AI is going to produce mass technological employment certainly within our lifetimes, and that universal basic income is the solution to this. I mean, have you found that this is sort of supercharged the movement, or has it had produced tensions within the movements? What's kind of the impact of these kind of tech people been?
It's a really good question. I think when I was in the US, it was clear that there were two camps, as you described, of kind of how people came into this, and I think it's no coincidence that some of the real energy around experiments and pilots in the US are happening around California and Silicon Valley, San Francisco area, Oakland. There's some really exciting, that's kind of if you like, at the moment where the real buzz is, and that's because, as you described, there has been this kind of interest from those in technology and who are kind of seeing up front and close about what's happening with AI and what that might do to the job market in the future, and how basic income can be a solution to that. Alongside that, there's this more, as you say, like a traditional group of people, particularly in the US, that come out of the civil rights movement and with racial and economic justice. And I think there was, at the time, I think there definitely was a tension, and I think that there still is a tension to a degree. But I think you are seeing them work together. So in the US, you're seeing Jack Dorsey, CEO and founder of Twitter, funding to the tune of millions and millions of pounds some of these pilots, and working with some of these mayors like Mayor Tubbs on the ground to get some of these things off the ground. So I think that people have recognised that there's a tension, and what you're now seeing, compared to even just 2 years ago, you're seeing those groups of people coming together and working together on a platform. So I think so that tension seems to be resolved a little bit. I think in the UK, I don't think, and this is partly because of that there isn't as much of a kind of Silicon Valley tech bro culture here. You don't really see that used as much as an argument, and I think that most of basic income is taken up by the more progressive expression, and that's where, when you look at the movement here, that's a large. In fact, I rarely see technologists in the space here, and I think that's a shame. I think there should, clearly it's a argument for basic income. Clearly there is a really important message to be had there, and I'd like to see that expand a lot in the UK, and think about how we can collaborate to grow this movement, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, obviously it's a really interesting, potentially very powerful alliance. I mean, having kind of progressive Democrats merged with some of the world's most successful business people, Elon Musk and Zuckerberg. It's a very interesting kind of combination. I mean, to take things back to the UK specifically, so obviously the Liberal Democrats now in favour of it, and that surprised me when they came out. I thought that was quite ballsy for them. The Green Party's in favour of it. The Labour Party seems a little bit on the fence. And I know there's some within the Labour movement, particularly in the trade union movement, who are actually slightly nervous about the idea. I mean, do you think that could be changed? Do you think you can kind of bring these people on board, or is it really always going to be a progressive argument against UBI?
I think so. It's interesting you ask that question after mentioning like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, because I think that's where some of the worry and hesitancy comes from. I think some in the progressive Labour movement look at, well, hang on a minute, if these people are in support of basic income, then it must be a bad idea. Now, I don't think that's a particularly mature way of looking at it. I think it's an important question to ask, and clearly basic income is not the answer to curbing some of the powers that these tech giants are now having. There needs to be absolutely other checks on their growing influence. But I think but they're going to need to be at the table. I think there's a sense of inevitability about something like a basic income one day happening at some point. And I think progressives, if that's the case, need to be at the table, making sure that if something like that is implemented, then it has is as progressive as possible. So I think, so that's the first thing. I think the other thing is like questions around work, right? So I think when it's framed so much, and I think probably too much in recent years, it's been framed as a solution to there being no jobs. And I don't think that's really true. I think the kind of more sobering thing is that it might not replace jobs entirely, but actually it's clearly the technology and AI, etc., is going to have a really destabilizing effect. It's going to change work a lot. We're already seeing that now, and the pandemic has accelerated that. So just today, I think that it's the Queen's speech, and the government are talking about adult learning and retraining. They're talking about extending student loans to allow adults to be able to study later in life. But how are you supposed to do that if you can't just quit your job and retrain in something? Like, I think there's something around that argument that there needs to be something like a basic income, some stability that would allow people to retrain into these new skills. And I think that right there is absolutely in the trade union movement's interest. Thinking about how we transition into these new green jobs of the future, and the role that basic income can play in that. So I think there's a slight reframing that basic income advocates need to do around work, and also recognizing that work is no longer just waged labor. Like, work is, this pandemic has highlighted, the hardest and most important work there is looking after loved ones, being a parent, to an extent volunteering in the community. Like, those are some of the hardest and most valuable jobs out there, yet they're currently valued at zero by the market and the state. So I think it's this reframing of work that that is going to ultimately convince trade unions, and we have to just meet them where they're at. And I think I used to work for a trade union. I used to be a labour organiser, and some of those concerns that they have are legitimate ones, and we need to. That's kind of why we're called the basic income conversation. We're not here to tell you this is right or wrong. Like, this is a conversation, and trade unions need to be front and centre at the table having that conversation.
I mean, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but I was looking recently. I thought it was really, really interesting that kind of the number of average hours that people work. I mean, kind of over the last century, it was sort of steadily falling. And you went from a 7 or 6 day week to a 5 day week, and you went down to sort of 40 hours or whatever, and then it kind of got stuck. And it's got stuck despite the fact that the economies continue to make steady but not spectacular progress. I mean, so obviously, sometimes you hear people in the same kind of school as UBI say like a 4 day week, or is it the same sort of idea? I mean, is this part of your argument for it? You want to kind of restructure our lifestyles to kind of better distribute the increase in welfare over the past few decades?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly think a 4 day week or a shorter working week sits nicely alongside a basic income and are very much complementary as ideas if they were to come in at a similar time. And absolutely, I think we as humans, certainly in the so-called developed countries, work too much. There's absolutely, but I think, again, I go back to reframing what work actually is. So I think we're in the so-called waged labour too much. We're working way too many hours, and that's mean that we spend far less time with our families, far less time doing leisure. But actually, in people's spare times, they are doing work. It's just not that it's paid. And I think we need to get. I don't think we can imagine a site where everyone's being artists and creatives and all of that stuff. But certainly, people would. When we have the conversation, for example, when we say, "What would you do with the basic income?" The amount of time that people say, "I would just work a little bit less. I wouldn't quit my job, because work is important and is a really important value, and that goes back centuries in our society. But they'd like to work a little bit less, and with that extra bit of time, they'd like to spend a bit more time with their family, and they'd probably like to, perhaps start a personal project of theirs, or work more in the community, or just have some rest." And I think we've got to find it'd be really interesting if a political party started to talk about that. At the moment, I think the response to the pandemic, I think Labour's phrase recently was jobs, jobs, jobs. And jobs absolutely is important, of course, but I think there's I don't know, it just seems a bit of a simplistic message, really, in terms of what work is actually going to look like in the next few decades. It's not going to be the same as what it was before. And as I said, I think basic income, it's not an end point where we're all just sat on a basic income, doing our arts and crafts, but it's a transition away from our current form of work into something much more sustainable. I hope that makes sense.
No, definitely. One thing that's always kind of surprised me a little bit, and perhaps it shouldn't do, is just how hostile a lot of conservatives are. I can kind of see where they're coming from, but because obviously basic income is compatible with socialism, but it's not in of itself socialism. It's a floor. It's not a ceiling. And you're obviously providing people a certain level of stability beyond which they can do all sorts of things. Have you got a way to reach out to conservatives? Do you think they'll kind of come around more? I should say I used to work for Tory MP, so I've sort of got roots in the movement, and I'm kind of just interested to see how different people react to it.
Yeah, no, well, mate, we should be asking you to think about how best to do that. But I think, well, first of all, I think it's just to recognise that I think it's quite a unique challenge in the UK. Because I think actually in other countries, I think in Belgium very recently, the leader of their equivalent of the Conservative Party came out and supported basic income. Yeah. In Canada, I met a Conservative senator who has been long talking about basic income, Senator Hugh Segal. But in the United States, there are Conservative supporters of this idea and has a longer Conservative tradition. I think what we have a particular challenge here in the UK. And a particular direction, I would argue, that the current Conservative government has taken in recent years, that means that it's more of a challenge for us to engage with those MPs in particular. However, I think there's the arguments around security, arguments around entrepreneurship, arguments around adult learning and reskilling are all like pretty safe, and freedom. They're all pretty safe conservative ideas, actually. And I really don't think it's as impossible as some people think to imagine the Conservative Party here one day backing a basic income. The reality is that if we are, not only do we need to win a basic income and government write this into legislation, we then need to keep a basic income. Yeah. And you've got to win it once through one government and then ultimately keep it. So things like the NHS, things like the minimum wage, whilst initially the Conservatives were against that, looking through history, ultimately now they're entrenched and support it. So I think so at some point we're going to have to get to a scenario where the Conservatives are on board with this, and that requires all of us to put in a lot of time and effort to build those relationships and convince them, and then and find a way of framing it that's going to work for them. So, so as I said, I think there's plenty of arguments there that means it's not an idea as you say, it's not a socialist idea at all. It's perfectly compatible with what this country can look like going forward. So I think you hear a lot about leveling up. I think that's the other buzzword at the moment. It is a buzzword at the moment. It doesn't quite mean anything. I know in the last few weeks, the Prime Minister has appointed a Conservative MP to head up a committee on actually designing what does levelling up actually look like. And I think a basic income can be part of that. I think levelling up cannot just be about infrastructure and building bridges and roads and free ports. It's got to be about investing in people. And you see in the United States where President Biden is talking about massive infrastructure plans, that he includes care work as infrastructure, and people ultimately are the infrastructure of this country. And I think investing in those people absolutely can fit into a levelling up agenda. And I think just finally, when we think about, if we say basic income is inevitably going to impact or benefit some communities more than others, those are disproportionately going to be in probably some of these so-called red wall areas that Conservatives have recently won. It's those areas that are like Hartlepool that absolutely stand to gain from a basic income. So I think there's enough there that I think if there's some willingness and some ideas, this current Conservative government could absolutely get on board with it. I haven't seen that yet, but I think there's certainly fertile ground for them. And behind the scenes, we know that there are a couple who are interested. I think they've just, I think the final thing I would say on this is that you've got to remember that for the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a Conservative Party that have backed universal credit and have spent so much of their own political capital on the success or failure of this. I think most would agree that it has been a failure and would say so privately. But I think as soon as a Conservative MP comes out and says that UBI is a good idea, you are basically admitting that universal credit is a crap idea, and that's for them at the moment is political suicide. And I can understand that if you're particularly in the middle of a pandemic where universal credit has been such an important piece of infrastructure for us getting through it, just a means of getting money out to people. Them trashing universal credit in the middle of a pandemic probably isn't a good piece of statecraft on their part. So I can understand that, and hopefully now as we move out of the worst of the initial phase one of this, then there might be some more free thinkers who start to think about what the system can look like moving forward. That's quite a long answer, but I think
no, it's a good answer.
Yeah, there's lots there.
Yeah, no, it covered lots of ground. I remember kind of thinking back to last year, so kind of March, April of last year. So when the pandemic was first hitting, and obviously everything was generally very miserable, but one thing I was kind of thinking is, oh great, this has pushed back social progress by 3-4 years. And I'm not so sure about that anymore. Because one thing, it has proven in the UK, across Europe, in the United States, is that you can have kind of big social interventions in the economy. So things like the furlough scheme, which would have been like unimaginable not so many years before, but you can do them without, obviously our economy, our balance of payments is a mess, but you can have those without the economy just falling to bits. I mean, do you think it's kind of raised the standards of what we can achieve? And do you think it might even have brought UBI forward?
Good question. I think there was certainly a moment, like in sort of this time last year, basically, where there's a lot of excitement among, as horrible as the moment was, there was a sense that, maybe this can be the time to change. I think there's been peaks and troughs since then in terms of if that's really going to sustain. I think we look to the United States and often for the last sort of 10, 15 years, progressives would say, don't look to the United States for any inspiration. But now people are saying that because I think what's happening there is not just a huge stimulus package that's unprecedented, not just a huge infrastructure package that's unprecedented. You're also starting to maybe see the so-called end of a kind of era of neoliberal politics and a reimagining of the role that the government can play. In terms of huge investment, and I think the other kind of bigger crisis that's hitting us, as we know, is the climate crisis. So I think as the world may or may not look to the United States as an inspiration, I think that's certainly exhibit A in terms of how the pandemic has certainly shifted what's economically possible. The furlough scheme is another one of those. I think the challenge that we face in the UK is that I think that some of the changes that we've seen have been done a bit reluctantly by the current government. It's not a natural fit for them, and I think they've been uncomfortable about it. That's why you've seen it too soon. They've tried to shut down the furlough scheme at every term. Too soon they've tried to open up the economy at great risk, which has cost lives. And I think there's this quite interesting discomfort that they have. So I think we'll have to see if that plays out over the coming years in the UK, if we can, meet the ambition that the US has set us in terms of having similar change. But absolutely, I think it's brought UBI front, as we mentioned earlier, into the mainstream. It's brought UBI front and center of a lot of people's thinking in terms of what a new social contract or a new social security system could look like, and in that sense alone, and I think it's certainly not pushed the idea any further back. It's certainly pushed it forward.
Yes, I've heard from some people who've been kind of involved in the movement who say that this time last year the government was obviously trying to decide what sort of financial support to provide, and there was talk of US-style financial stimulus payments, and that the TUC lobbied very heavily for furlough. The TUC was actually quite sceptical about stimulus payments. I don't know if that's complete rubbish. I don't know if that's something you've heard. I just sort of thought I'd throw it out there and see what you made of it.
I think they were looking at it. I think in those crazy weeks around late March, I think everything was on the table.
Yeah.
It's really interesting the role the TUC plays. I think they really helped Sunak by being involved in those and gave him a lot of political cover in terms of what he was doing, because they were very much, their thing was protecting. You got to remember that the trade unions, their self-interest is their members and those in work, and that's why we've seen a furlough scheme that is brilliant at protecting people who are in work, because it protects their wages more or less. What it's not very good at is protecting people out of work, and we've seen people who have more complicated work arrangements become the 3 million excluded. And I think you've seen there's no safety net for people, and I think that wasn't really baked in enough in those early conversations. That's why it's not so many people have fallen through the cracks. I think the other thing to say was, I think even if you wanted to do a UBI, let's say Sunak, they were looking at measures and they decided that they were going to do a basic income. There was a lot of concern at the time was that there just wasn't the infrastructure to get money into people's bank accounts, because they didn't have everybody's bank account details. And that's the other thing about our quite archaic system, is that even if you wanted, the thing about stimulus checks is that they are literally checks, which we don't really use anymore in the UK. Or it's amazing that the US still uses checks as an actual piece of paper. What's the modern version of that? Well, it'll be a quick bank transfer, but as I said, there aren't the databases for them, and so it's not impossible. You'd basically have to do a few months' work at the HMRC and the DWP and the Treasury to put together a database to get everyone's details. But that would have taken a few weeks and months to do. And at the time, in late March, they needed to do something really, really fast. And so it was a kind of cobbled together scheme, which just about worked. But as I said, left a lot of people missing out.
Yeah. So I'll just a slight sort of change in direction, but so obviously we talked about the tech advocates of UBI. And it's very interesting reading some of their writings. Some of it sometimes feels a tad utopian, but their general sort of philosophy is that advancing AI will basically kind of become better than humans in more and more fields, one by one. And that obviously, A, that will cause unemployment, but B, that also has a positive side effect, and that you could have a society in which people work very, very little, and that a huge proportion of the work is done by AI, by machines. And people talk about the post-work world. We're kind of living in the final generations of the human species that would actually have to have near compulsory work if you want to live a decent life. Are those arguments that you find interesting? Because it's sort of slightly different angle to where you come at it from. But is that something you find?
Absolutely, no, they're fascinating, and I think that there needs to be. I think too often people just use the argument of we've heard that before. Yeah. People have always said that work is going to disappear, and it's never happened. And I just think that's whilst that may be true, it's a little bit naive, because I think clearly there are elements of what's happening now which is different to before, and therefore that we can't just use old solutions to look at this. But I've read a really interesting book recently called The Technology Trap. A guy called what's his first name? Frey. He's an academic at University of Oxford, and I think kind of flips this and talks about looking at the earlier industrial revolutions that we've seen, and so changes to technology, changed the way things were produced and introduced factories and things like this. And yes, jobs ultimately, more jobs actually were created because of these changes to technology. But that took like decades. I think our memory of that is like, oh, suddenly there were lots of new jobs. Actually, there was like decades of change. And that also meant that it was one of the most unstable parts of our history in terms of the formation of trade unions, like huge changes that the state had to do in order to respond to the, people being out of work, huge violence, upheaval, and like this instability basically that was caused by it. And so there may be a moment where these technology, changes that we're seeing now gets to a point where work will have changed, and we would have reinvented what work looks like, and we would all be back in some kind of work. But in the intervening period, which I think we are slap bang in the middle of right now, it is enormously unstable for people, and there are losers in that, in the sense that they're not going to be able to retrain and find some of these new jobs. It's too late for them, and they are like absolutely terrified. And I think that's driving some of the quite wild politics that we are seeing around Brexit and Donald Trump. But I think is also, partly explains a little bit of what's happening in the kind of realignment that we're seeing in British politics as well. In the sense that there's some really it's not talked about much, but actually, like when you map on the Brexit vote and map on the areas that are most at risk of automation, that's the strongest correlation to explain the Brexit vote than any other, age, demographic, background, etc. There's the Institute of the Future of Work have done that research, and so I think there's not enough talked about the kind of the instability that is causing, that's happening right now, and how that's impacting our politics. So yeah, I think it's not a question of. I think it's just a thought exercise sometimes about talking about whether or not we live in a post-work society. I think there's not enough of a thought exercise about what's happening now in terms of the changes to technology and what that is doing, and the kind of dangers that poses to our politics.
That's really interesting. I mean, I had Scott Sampson's on, who made a very similar point, that they've been doing some investigations, and the kind of the key Midwestern states that Trump took in 2016, but previously Democrat states, that mapped very heavily with. I think Andrew Yang says the same thing. Mapped very heavily with kind of the automation of factory jobs. The argument being that this is the direction we're heading in. So that's almost like a warning what's to come if we don't adjust this new society with something like UBI. And I thought that was a really, really interesting argument.
It's really powerful. I remember hearing that at the time in the US and thinking, well, is that true in the UK? And it's only recently has that research been done. And yes, it has. It also, that not just with the Brexit vote, that continues to be mapped onto the 2019 general election in terms of some of the areas that swung. And I can send you some of the research, because I can't believe more people aren't talking about it. And I think we're stuck in a politics where Labour Party are talking about whether we should wave more flags or not. I mean, it's really not addressing the real nub of what people are feeling, which is this sense of insecurity. I think insecurity is like the ultimate feeling of our age, and I think coronavirus has brought that home to everybody, because you realise actually our jobs are not that secure, and the kind of safety nets that we'd built as a society are no longer there, whether that's a good welfare state, whether it's membership of a trade union, or membership of a kind of community group or a church or something like all the kind of, or owning your own home, like all of those things that were like element of security are now kind of ebbing away, and people are like looking down and realizing, well, there's nothing to stand on. And I think that's really scary. And I'm not saying basic income can solve that, but it can play a role in providing at least a plank of security that people can at least know is there, that you can always stand on. And I think politicians that talk about it in those frames might see some success.
Yeah, I mean, I find it a really interesting argument, because it obviously suggests that Trump isn't just an accident, or he isn't just very good at social media. There are fundamental structural problems that created the kind of wave of, populism is the word usually, so I'll stick with that, of populism that kind of swept the world apart. I mean, not just the United States, but Bolsonaro in Brazil, Poland, all sorts of places.
Yeah.
But the kind of logical extension of that argument is, well, if we're just at the beginning of that process, i.e. of the automation replacing jobs and AI, and obviously at the moment it's mainly concentrated in blue collar jobs, but as AI improves, I think a lot of people think it will start moving into middle collar, white collar jobs as well. So you can see that kind of political instability, almost like a warning of what's to come if we don't act. And on top of that, it won't just be the working class that will be pissed off. You'll have a lot of middle class people who are really pissed off, people who have traditionally been pretty comfortable. So I find that a fascinating argument. Oh, sorry, you're going to come in.
Well, I mean, I think it's when, maybe it's a sad indictment of our politics, but it's when middle class people, because they tend to have more of a voice in our society, and it's when they start feeling this, which I do think has begun a little bit with the pandemic. I think people who previously never thought that they would need to use the social security system or the benefit system, are now having to enroll on universal credit and things like that, and thinking, hang on a minute, is it really like this? Do I actually have to wait 5 weeks to get this amount? I thought I paid into the system and I'm getting this much back. Like, how is this fair? And I think there has been a little bit of a through the looking glass kind of moment for some people, being like, hang on, is this really what it's like? And it's once that continues to move out, and people are going to start to get angry about this.
I just want to talk one kind of final topic. So obviously in America, the last few years, interest in UBI has exploded, and some of that, or perhaps a lot of that, has been associated with Andrew Yang, who is, if you kind of mention UBI as an American, it kind of goes around Yang. We don't have an equivalent like that in Britain. I was wondering, do we need one? Do we need some high? Because I think, Andy Burnham seemed quite interested, so I don't know if he could be Britain's Andrew Yang. Do we need kind of like a high-profile politician to advocate for it in the way that he does? And secondly, the kind of the counterpoint is there a disadvantage to that in having very associated one individual? I know that Yang is controversial with some people for various reasons.
Yeah, great question. I mean, as I said earlier, I was in the US around the time of the first US presidential debate. So it's just kind of, and I met some of the Yang gangs out there, and it was a really exciting time. I think you're right just to note that there has been, he's not universally popular amongst UBI advocates. And I think it illustrates a little bit of the tension I mentioned earlier about him being perceived. I don't think this is an unfair perception of him being perceived as solely from the kind of tech entrepreneur background. But I think actually when you listen to him, I think he straddles both kind of traditions in terms of his thinking around basic income. And whatever people say, he has done more for basic income to get it on the agenda than I think anyone else. And that's not to take away from the really hard work, grassroots, that people like Mayor Tubbs and the other activists on the ground who are doing work. But he's definitely accelerated that because of the public profile he's had. And I think absolutely we need to have something like, a British version. Clearly, our politics doesn't really allow for a kind of someone out of nowhere to come along and run for high office. So it's harder for someone like a Yang to emerge. So it will require someone who comes from a little bit more of a traditional political background. And that might be, I think that the real energy that you're going to see, it's interesting you mentioned Andy Burnham, will probably, the closest thing I think will be like a mayor who has a kind of enough of a platform to be a bit more loose in terms of what they're talking about and not be constrained by the dynamics that Westminster gives. And so I think the real energy for basic, and this maps have got, going back to the United States, maps on there as well in terms of the real energy for this is at a mayoral municipal level. It's only just creeping into the federal politics. And I think you're going to see the same here. You're going to see mayors, or it's interesting that Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford are now talking about. I think you're going to see those kind of politicians talk about it first, and as usual, Westminster will be playing catch up. So, So yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Andrew Yang. In my cupboard here, I got Yang merch, got my math hat. It's really exciting. I think what they were able to do really well, as I was leaving the US, it was obviously it's apparent that he wasn't going to win the nomination. The real trick would be, well, can you turn that energy into a movement? Because I would honestly say at the 2 years ago, I wouldn't even, it would be a stretch to call this a movement really. And when I was searching around the US, it was still remarkable how much it was talked about, yet how little people were really actively involved in that now. I think what his campaign did was that you then had a Yang gang in almost every major city in the United States. And so there was finally some infrastructure there to build out of. And each of it's looked different in different parts of the country, but there's now there's the income movement, which is really exciting. There's Humanity Forward. There's now some actual institutions and organizational infrastructure around the movement, and that means it's maturing. And I know there's brilliant pieces of work going on behind the scenes to connect those different groups up. And I think you're now seeing that the same here in the UK. You've got the UBI Lab Network, you've got Basic Income UK, there's us at the Basic Income Conversation, there's Basic Income Network Scotland. There's kind of these groups that are now coming together. And I think that shows the maturity of and the growth in terms of the movement that we're seeing. So I think that, if you like, we're kind of like the different Yang gangs that have popped up. But no, I don't think we're going to see it happen in the same way. But I do think we're going to see, a politician, probably a mayor, probably a first minister, take it on.
Just one final question. I mean, if you're kind of, is it quite UK specific? But if you're in the UK and you want to boost the cause for UBI, what's the most effective tactic to use? Is it to kind of lobby the current politicians, I guess, or kind of work within the existing party structure? Or is there a case for some kind of new organisation? What's the best way to go about this?
Well, I think, at some point we're going to need a government to sign this into legislation. So it's vital that we do have a kind of political strategy that encourages, politicians to get on board with this. So lobbying there's been a lot of work done to lobby local authorities to pass motions in favour of councils at least expressing an interest in pilots. I think that's helped. I think we've just seen a local election campaign which has seen politicians sign pledges, which is great. There's also groups setting up within political parties. We've played a role in helping to form Labour for a basic income and Lib Dems for a basic income. And that's actually how Lib Dems passed the motion.
Or is that still to be made?
That's still to be made. But that's so I think that those kind of things are really important. The only thing I would say is that we've spent a lot of time over the last year leaning into the political space, and that's been the right thing to do because there's been a big opportunity, and we've kind of hoovered up a lot of support there that now is expressed in terms of, as you're saying, you're sort of noticing this cross-party support, which is fantastic. I think the next phase is thinking about, well, what about civil society? What about the organisations? What about the pressure groups, the charities? Because a lot of politicians that I speak to, they say, look, I'm convinced, like you've convinced me, but I speak to my constituents, and I speak to other so-called expert organisations in this space, and they're like a little bit hesitant. So what's going on there? And I think we need to spend more time, and this is why we talk about the conversation, supporting those organisations to have a conversation about how would basic income intersect with your work, how would it impact your members, how would it, etc. And I think once we start to see those organisations coming out and backing a basic income, I think the political space will be much more safe for Conservatives, for the Labour to come out and back it. So I think there's a piece of work that us as in the movement need to do in terms of building that kind of paving the way, I guess. And I think that my theory of change, and this is to kind of link up nicely to what I was saying at the beginning, is around what the living wage campaign was able to do. It was able to make this politically safe because of the coalitions that were built between faith groups and businesses and schools and charities that all saw the impact that low pay was having on their communities, and were all convinced that living wage was the answer to that. I think now we need to see, well, all these organisations see the impact that insecurity is having on their people. Basic income is potentially one of the answers to that insecurity.
Michael, it's been so great to have you on. It's been really interesting, fascinating. You say you brought us some really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for your time.